everybody's well. How many lectures have I done now for my
Probably
health?
about 6 or 7, maybe. I don't know, even know. I'm losing count, and we have some in the future coming up.
A lot of them. A lot of
Yeah.
them is the answer. So thanks, Nicole, and thanks, Ashley, for the details. Hello, Jen. I hope everybody's well. So I'm going to try to share screen here 1 second. And boom.
There
Okay,
you go.
now I'll put it on full screen view for you. There we go. All right, everybody. So welcome. So I've covered a lot of topics with you over the last, oh gosh, it's been a year or so now, hasn't it?
Yeah, a little
Goodness
over, yeah.
gracious. How about that? So this one's a little bit different. I've written or edited 46 books, and most of them are on military history, campaign history, social justice issues. And then there's this book. This one's like R-rated. All the rest of mine are normal. So this is, so during the lecture, if you all want to light a cigarette or put some perfume on or light a candle, open up a bottle of wine, this book's a little bit R-rated. So I will behave, though, out of respect for Nicole and Jen and Ashley, of course. But what I did is I had an idea back toward the beginning of my career. I wanted to write books on the presidents. And there are so many books on the presidents that I was trying to find a way of studying the presidency and exploring different aspects of the presidency that we may have overlooked, that history might have missed. And I thought of the idea of, well, maybe I'll write a book about the first ladies. And I talked about that with you in the past. So by studying the person closest to the president, we can gain new insights into the president's personal life, social life, temperament, character, and so on. So I wrote a book about the first ladies as a way of better understanding the president. Then I put together a book on life in the White House, the kids of the president, what it's like to live in the White House, what do they eat, what's the president's favorite room in the building, that sort of a thing. So then I was thinking of a third book, so I'd have a trilogy. I've written, I think, about 3 or 4 three-part series, if you will, three or four trilogies. So I started thinking about it, and I thought, you know, what about a book on presidential affairs? What about the mistress, the other woman, so to speak? And let's see what that can tell us about the presidents. And of course, it's a topic that has been completely overlooked for obvious reasons. And historians haven't really gone there with this topic. So I thought, well, let's do it and see what comes of it. I got the idea for looking at affairs and love lives and so on by I was going to write a book on George and Martha Washington being together during the winters of the Revolutionary War. For 7 winters, Martha rode in a carriage miles and miles, hundreds of miles sometimes, to be with George Washington during the war. And that was difficult because you didn't have GPS. It was in the middle of the winter through enemy territory, unpaved roads. So I thought that would be interesting to see how George and Martha, you know, how they managed during the winters of the war. But what happened was one of the winters when Martha showed up in camp, George Washington's aide, Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton was a lot like Harry Truman in that he seemed incapable of lying. So if Hamilton said something, you can cash a check on it. So Hamilton said, and he wrote rather the following when Martha Washington arrived in camp. He wrote, quote unquote, "Thank goodness Lady Washington has arrived in camp. The good general has been inconsolable. Now we can finally get down to the matter of winning the war," end quote. And I thought, how the heck is Martha's presence in camp going to help them win the war? What was she, SEAL Team 6, Special Forces? And then I was reading further, and Hamilton wrote that Martha was, George was volcanic. Then when Martha arrived, George's mood lightened, and he was in a much more agreeable mood around Martha. And it dawned on me, they must have had sex. And I thought, well, George hadn't seen Martha in 9 months. He thought he was going to die. The war wasn't going well. So that's something worth thinking about. So I thought maybe I should write about that. So here's our book. So what I found in writing this book was that Bill Clinton wasn't the first president to have an affair, and he wasn't even the worst. There's a long history of that. In fact, if I were to list the top 5 dogs in the history of the presidency, I don't think Bill Clinton would even make that list. That's how bad they were. I also found out that even Abraham Lincoln, yep, say it isn't so, everybody, even Abraham Lincoln misbehaved. Now, not when he was married, but as a young man, before he married Mary Todd, it appears that Lincoln not once but twice visited a prostitute. So if you'd like, Nicole, do I have your permission to tell this story? Jen, is this okay? All right.
Absolutely, go for it.
All right, here we go. And I promise I'll scrub it nice and clean. So when Lincoln was a young man, he was moving from Indiana to Illinois, and he went to the town that he moved into. He went to a general store in the town run by a guy named Joshua Speed. Now, Lincoln and Speed would later become best friends. And Lincoln goes into the store, and Speed writes a letter about it saying Lincoln's getting, coffee and flour and tea and a saddle and shoes. And I mean, he's getting everything. And while he's shopping in the general store, he goes up to the counter and says to Speed, Speed, there's something I neglected to tell you. I don't have any money. I'm going to need everything on credit. And Speed wrote that he said it was the saddest, most honest face he'd ever seen. So he said, okay. And Lincoln would later come back and work everything off, and then some. And as Lincoln was walking out of the store, Speed says to him, Lincoln, have you even got a place to stay? And Lincoln apparently shakes his head no. So Speed says, I have a 1-room up above the store. You can stay with me until you get your feet on the ground. Without saying anything, Lincoln walks up the steps with carrying all this stuff, walks down empty-handed a minute later and says to Speed, well, Speed, I'm all moved in. And of course, then they would live together and become best friends. So shortly thereafter, a prostitute is visiting Speed. And while Speed's conducting business with the prostitute, my guess is Lincoln is either in the corner of the room with a pillow over his head or downstairs. I don't know. We just don't know. When Speed finishes business and the woman leaves, Lincoln comes up to Speed and he says, quote unquote, Speed, I've got to have a woman. It's been forever. And Speed says, well, you can have her. She's a professional. So only Lincoln would do this. This is cute, everybody. I think you'll like this. Lincoln asks Speed for a letter of introduction for a prostitute. Armed with the letter of introduction, Lincoln goes to visit the woman. Now, we also have a letter from the woman written back to Speed. So here's what she says. Lincoln comes in and she charges him $5, which is an extraordinary amount of money. That's like the kind of money Elliot Spitzer was running on his credit card. You remember that one, everybody? Of course, it's not nearly as much as what Donald Trump was paying off Stormy Daniels, but it was a lot of money. So Lincoln says to the prostitute, says, ma'am, I don't have any money. I can't afford that. So she says, well, you can pay me when you come into the money. And he says, I can't even imagine when I would have $5. So the woman writes to Speed and says, same thing Speed said. It was the most honest and sad face I'd ever seen. She says, I told him, this one's on the house. And she said, Lincoln got up scared to death and ran away. Isn't that cute? There we go. So there's my cute prostitute story. So Lincoln ran away. I would love to have been a fly on the wall back at Speed's house when Lincoln came home and Speed said, how was it, Lincoln? And he said, I ran away. I got afraid. So one of the worst dogs in the history of the office was Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was always misbehaving. He had a house and a ranch outside of Austin in Texas. And like most presidents, he would go back there for a working vacation. You know, most presidents work while they're, um, back at their home. So Johnson had 6 rooms upstairs in the house slash ranch. And he would bring aides back with him and they would stay in all these guest rooms. And then he would work while he was there. Johnson always brought a young woman from the secretarial pool. In other words, not one of the usual secretaries, but someone like a temp. And they were always in their young 20s. So he brought this woman back with him, and she stayed in the 6th room down the hallway when you come up or go upstairs. Why was she in the 6th room? That's where the secretaries always stayed, because that room did not have a lock on the door. So you can see where we're going here. There's 2 aides who tell this story. They recorded their story for the Johnson Presidential Library, and I sat in the basement and listened to it on an audio recording. The aides were in the 1st room. They said in the middle of the night, they could hear the unmistakable sound of Lyndon Johnson coming up the steps. He was a big guy, well over 6 foot tall, well over 200 pounds. They heard these heavy, steps coming up stairs. Then they heard Johnson hacking and snorting and making all the gross sounds that he always made down the hallway. He gets down to the room at the end of the hallway, and they heard the door open, and Johnson went in the room. So the 2 guys get out of bed, they peek down the hallway, and they go running down the hallway to listen. Wouldn't you? I would, and I'd write a book about it. I write a book about everything. So they heard the sound of the bed, the mattress, the press from a heavy body sitting on it. And then they heard Johnson say one thing. He says, quote unquote, "Move over. This is your president speaking." After a while, they heard the headboard, banging against the wall for a while. And then when that stopped, the 2 aides go running down the hallway and hid in their room. They said to their horror, a little while later, they heard their doorknob turning. They thought, oh my gosh, President Johnson must have heard us out in the hallway running around. So they got up and they tried to pretend that they were asleep. And they opened the door, and Johnson's standing there with a t-shirt and nothing else on. He walks into the room and sits down on the edge of the bed and starts talking with them about politics, the ranch, football, whatever. And both aides are in bed and they're going, this is surreal. The president's sitting on the edge of the bed naked talking to us about politics. After a while, Lyndon Johnson gets up and goes downstairs. And the aides thought that was crazy. That was surreal. The next day, they're out at his pool and they're sitting around in lounge chairs. Johnson's in the pool with that young secretary. Lady Bird Johnson, President Johnson's wife, the first lady, comes walking out, and she's carrying a tray of drinks like iced tea, lemonade. And she walks up to the 2 aides, and when she offers them the drink, she's looking at them, but she's talking to Lyndon, who's behind her in the pool with the secretary. She offers the aides the drink, and she says, "Lyndon, were you upstairs last night?" And she's looking straight at the aides. So the aides said that they couldn't lie and say he wasn't, because they'd be lying to the first lady. But they couldn't say that he was upstairs because they'd be ratting out the president. So they just sat there mortified. But from behind Lady Bird Johnson, Lyndon Johnson bails himself out. He says, "Of course I was upstairs last night. I went up to shoot the breeze with the fellas. Didn't I, fellas?" And they nodded their heads. Then they realized why Lyndon Johnson stopped at their room. Not that he had caught them, but he needed an alibi. When the aides got back to Washington, they told all the other aides that the president, had the secretary down in the end of the hallway. He stopped at their room, and all the other aides knew the story. They said he did that when we were there. So it was not only Lyndon Johnson's alibi, it was his MO. Johnson was someone who worked around the clock. He worked nights, he worked weekends. He was known to impulsively call aides in the middle of the night and just start barking out orders to them. One aide described that one day Johnson's talking to the aide and he's barking orders and take notes and do this and do that. And then Johnson says, I have to go to the bathroom. So he tells the aide to follow him into the bathroom. And Johnson walks in and is going to the bathroom while the aide's standing there trying to avert his eyes. While Johnson's going to the bathroom, he finally stops giving orders to the aide and he looks down at his presidential private parts and he starts talking to him. He says, "You were amazing last night. Man, that girl was quite something." And he's saying all this stuff. And the aide's, going, "Oh my gosh, Mr. President." Johnson turns around and exposes himself to the aide and says, "I'd like you to meet my friend. His name is Jumbo." Anywho, here's the story. Thomas Jefferson on the left. On the right is a painting of Sally Hemings. Now, there is no known likeness of Sally Hemings that we're aware of. So this is probably an artist's imagined view of what she may or may not have looked like once upon a time. Sally Hemings was Thomas Jefferson's biracial slave mistress. And the story is Jefferson marries a woman named Martha. Now, Martha Wales Skelton, her father came over from Europe with nothing, and he makes money the old-fashioned way. He marries a wealthy woman, married up. And they have a daughter, and that daughter is Martha, who would later marry Jefferson. The mother then died, so John Wales marries a second wife. And the second wife has 3 daughters. And then the second wife dies. He marries a third wife. She has a daughter, and the third wife dies. So now John Wales has buried 3 wives, and he has 5 daughters, the oldest of which is Martha. He needs someone to help take care of all these young girls, but he's not going to marry again. So around that time, there's a shipping captain. His name is Hemings, and he's the shipping captain who takes John Wales's tobacco back and forth across the ocean to sell it in England. So John Wales is owed money by Captain Hemings. So Wales goes to see Hemings and says, "I need the money now." Captain Hemings says, "I'm sorry, I don't have the money." So John Wales is threatening to take a ship from him and tell him, "You work for me now if you can't pay me." So Hemings says, "Why don't you come up to my captain's quarters and let's talk about this?" John Wales goes up there, and sitting in the captain's quarters is Captain Hemings's biracial slave mistress. She's half black, half white, Elizabeth Hemings. So Wales gets one look at her, and apparently she was an extremely beautiful woman. And John Wales falls head over heels for this biracial slave mistress. So he tells Captain Hemings, "I'll let you keep your ship, but I want to take her." So that's the deal. He takes Elizabeth Hemings back to his plantation with him. Now, she doesn't live in the field or in the quarters with the other enslaved individuals. She lives in the house and shares a bedroom with John Wales. And she bears John Wales several children. The youngest of those children is Sally Hemings. So if you're doing the math, John Wales is the father of both Sally Hemings and Martha, who would marry Jefferson. So Martha Jefferson and Sally Hemings are half sisters. So they probably look something alike. We know that Martha Jefferson was attractive. She was elegant. She played the harpsichord. She painted. So Sally Hemings must have been a very attractive, very impressive young woman as well. So what happens is Martha had married a man before she married Jefferson. His name was Bathurst Skelton, and they had a son. Then the son and the husband died. So Martha is now a widow, and she moves back home. That's when Jefferson comes a courting. She marries Jefferson, and they move to Monticello. Now, she has 6 children in 10 years. So do the math, everyone. She's always pregnant. And with each birth, she gets weaker and weaker and weaker. 3 of her 6 children with Jefferson die in infancy. By the time of her 6th pregnancy, Jefferson doesn't think she's going to make it. She delivers a daughter named Lucy. I found the attending physician's report. He said it was the largest baby he'd ever delivered, and the birth killed the mother. So Jefferson now buries his wife. He has three daughters at home, and he lost three in infancy. Jefferson is so distraught that he burns every portrait, every letter, and every likeness of his wife. She's the only person who would be married to someone who would become president that we don't know what she looked like. He burns everything. Jefferson, for 2 years, is distraught and turns down all jobs and so forth. Now, he's just grieving his wife. Now, in the interim, what happened was his wife, Martha, her father had died. So Elizabeth, little Sally Hemings, all of them moved to Monticello with Jefferson. And Sally grows up at Monticello. She is a slave who's assigned to take care of Jefferson's daughters. Now, Jefferson finally accepts a job and he goes to Paris. The reason he goes to Paris is because he's trying to forget his wife. And everywhere he goes in his house, Monticello, he's reminded of his wife. Now, when he goes to Paris, he's about 39 and he has an affair with a young 20-something, and you're looking at her. Her name is Maria. Maria is an artist, a beautiful woman, and a very talented woman. She was married to a bisexual British artist by the name of Richard Causeway. And her husband would always sleep with the men that he painted. So he's, traveling around Europe, sleeping with all these models that he paints, leaving her alone in Paris. She and Jefferson meet and they fall in love. It's Jefferson's love of his life, I believe. And I believe he was the love of her life as well. They go out into the countryside and they paint and read poetry together. They're inseparable. The problem is she wants to leave her husband and marry Jefferson, but Jefferson won't marry her. It's an impossible situation. She decides she is going to leave and leave both Jefferson and her husband. She moves back to her native Italy and joins a convent and becomes a nun. This is how distraught she was because Jefferson wouldn't marry her. By the way, she was a talented artist, as I said. This is her self-portrait. She painted herself here. So you can see a very attractive, very interesting woman. When she leaves, Jefferson is just beside himself. He escorts her to her carriage at the port to bid her adieu as she sails away. Jefferson is so wildly in love, you can get a sense of it. Here's some quotes from Jefferson's letter to her. He said, hoping that she will come and visit him in Virginia when he leaves France and goes back to Virginia. He says, when you come again, I will employ myself solely in finding or fancying that you have some faults, and I will draw a veil over all your good qualities if I can find one large enough. He writes when he took her to the port to say goodbye, he wrote, having performed the last sad office of handing you into your carriage and seeing the wheels get actually in motion, I turned and walked more dead than alive. He would later write to her and say, when wafting on the bosom of the ocean, I shall pray it to be calm and smooth as yours to me. Be our affections unchangeable, and if our little history is to last beyond the grave, be it the longest chapter. And then in French he writes, I will always love you. Gentlemen, you may want to take notes here because I'm giving you some good lines. This is some impressive stuff. Mr. King, you taking notes? Barbara, get him a notepad because that's some good stuff. Jen, tell your husband I said hi and pass him along a copy of this, okay? Oops, let me go back. Anyway, so Jefferson is distraught after saying goodbye to Maria, but something happens. He takes his oldest daughter with him to France. The other two, including the baby, are back in Virginia. Abigail Adams sails across the Atlantic and goes to visit Jefferson with some terrible news. The little baby, Lucy, that the mother died while giving birth to, the baby died. So now Jefferson's lost 4 of his 6 kids. So Abigail Adams says, shame on you for not having your other daughter with you. Her name was Polly, Maria, or they called her Polly. So Jefferson writes back to Virginia and tells Polly to come across the Atlantic and live with him in France. And he asks that the biracial slave, Mistress Elizabeth, who would be the mother of Sally, that Elizabeth escort Polly. Now, Elizabeth doesn't. She stays in Virginia. We don't know why. Instead, little Sally sails across the Atlantic to be with Jefferson. Now, what we know is when Sally is in France, she is the toast of Parisian society. Men write poetry about her. Men in Versailles, ambassadors, which would be called ministers back then, aristocrats, all are in love with Sally. She's known as the African Venus. Jefferson buys her the latest French fashions. And even in Virginia, where it's illegal to teach and it's a slave to read or write, Jefferson teaches Sally French. What we know is when Jefferson sails back to Virginia, Sally goes back with him and she's pregnant. She would have 6 children with Jefferson, 5 of whom survive. It would be the only 5 slaves that Jefferson would ever free. There were a lot of tongue wagging, and there was an article written by a reporter named James T. Callender, and he used a very racist, derogatory term. He said, whenever you go to Monticello, there's a lot of light-skinned slaves running around. He called them yellow Toms, which is very derogatory and racist. Jefferson was 6'2", orange-haired, freckled, and pale. There were a lot of very tall, orange-haired, freckled slaves running around Monticello. So, oh, and by the way, the reporter, James T. Callender, that broke that story about Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Jefferson was president from 1801 to 1809. In 1802, his second year, that's when Callender wrote the story. Right after that story was published, Callender was found face first dead in a creek, and it was an unsolved mystery. How about that, everybody? Is that a good one? A whore in the White House. Holy smokes. That's Andrew Jackson on the left. And that's his wife, Rachel Donaldson, on the right. Now, Rachel's father, John Donaldson, was a colonel, and he was one of the first white men to settle what would become Tennessee and Kentucky. He took a group of settlers out there, fought Indians, hacked it out of the woods. So he's the leading man of the Tennessee and Kentucky territory. His daughter, Rachel, when she's a young girl, she's a debutante. She's the leading daughter of the Tennessee and Kentucky territory. However, she does what a proper girl ought not to do. Against her parents' wishes, she runs away and marries a much older man. His name is Louis Robards. Now, Robards is emotionally abusive with her. My guess is probably physically abusive too. So she does what a proper girl ought not to do a second time. She leaves his butt and she goes back home. Now, while she's back home, there's an Indian raid on the community, and her father and brothers and many of the men in the community were killed in the raid. So now Rachel and her widowed mother are living in a large home in the middle of Indian territory, in the middle of Tennessee. So the mother opens up the home for boarders as a way of making a living and also for security. One of the boarders she let stay for free was a lawyer named Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson and Rachel fall in love. The problem was, 1, Rachel was married to Louis Robards. 2, women could not legally divorce then, only men could. So Jackson writes a letter to Louis Robards telling him, if you don't divorce Rachel, I will come and find you. And with my sword, I will cut off both your ears and something else too. Now, when Andrew Jackson threatened something, he always made good on his threat. He was a duelist who killed men in duels. Andrew Jackson was so full of lead from dueling and his years in service, they said when Jackson walked, he sounded like a can full of rocks if you shake it. So Jackson threatened Robards, so Robards writes back and says, I'll give Rachel the divorce. What happens is Jackson and Rachel go down to the Natchez and they get married. However, When they come back, they find out that Robards never gave the divorce. So now Rachel's married to two men at the same time. She's known as Lady Bigamist or the Whore of Tennessee. Now, it's a terrible scandal. Rachel's mortified by the scandal. Jackson decides he's going to run for president. So Rachel is praying and wishing that he won't run or that he will lose. She can't bear the thought of her scandal becoming a national scandal when she has to move to the White House. So be careful what you wish for, everybody. Jackson wins, but Rachel then dies of a heart attack right after the election. She's buried on Christmas Eve of 1828 in the gown that she was supposed to wear to the inauguration. So Jackson goes to the inaugural a widower. Now remember, they were saying that there was going to be a whore in the White House. So Jackson is livid. He blames all of his opponents for killing his wife because of their scandal mongering. He said she died of a broken heart. Now, the question remains, who's going to be the first lady? Jackson doesn't have a daughter. His wife is dead. Who's going to be the first lady? So around that time, there's an image of Jackson fighting duels. By the way, as a sidebar for you, did Jackson fight duels because of political disagreements? The answer is no. Why did he fight the duels? Because of what men said about his wife, which is true. So Jackson, I'm going to skip that. On the eve of his inauguration, Jackson announces that that man on the left, that's John Eaton, he's a senator from Tennessee. He said, Eaton is going to be my main advisor, and I'm going to nominate him to be the Secretary of War. Today it's called Secretary of Defense. Harry Truman changed the name after World War II. So Senator John Eaton is going to become the Secretary of War. What's the relevance of that? Here's what it is. Right before the inauguration, Senator Eaton announces he's going to marry the most famous whore in Washington, D.C. It's a huge scandal. That's her on the right. Take a look at her. What an attractive woman, right, everybody? Doesn't she look very contemporary? You know, when you see pictures of people back in the early 1800s, they look like they were in the early 1800s. She looks like an Elizabeth Taylor. Her name is Little Peg, Peggy O'Neill. And Peggy O'Neill was nicknamed the politician's pet. It was said that she slept with most of the cabinet and half the Congress. So she was the most famous whore in Washington. Her father, John O'Neill, was an Irishman that operated a boarding house slash tavern slash brothel. So she was the featured entertainment at the brothel, kind of like a Mae West. She would come down the steps with a boa, sing songs, sit on everybody's lap, and sleep with everybody in Congress. Now, that brothel, O'Neill's Tavern, was where Andrew Jackson, Senator Eaton, and many other politicians used to board. Am I saying that Congress used to board at whorehouses when they went to Washington? The answer is yes. Now, Peggy then shocks everybody, even in addition to being the most famous whore in Washington. She runs away and marries a guy in the Navy. His name is Timberlake. Timberlake has to go back to sea on duty. And when he's out at sea for 2 years, Peggy gives birth to their first child. So it's a giant scandal. Andrew Jackson and Senator Eaton pay for the child. Timberlake comes back and he's embarrassed, mortified. He has to go back on duty, so he goes back to sea for 2 more years, and Peggy gives birth to their second child. So Andrew Jackson and Senator Eaton pay for that child. Now, so it's a giant scandal. So this is a couple years earlier. So now it's time for the inaugural, and John Eaton marries Little Peg. And on the eve of the inaugural, Andrew Jackson announces that Little Peg is going to function as the first lady. Didn't they say there was going to be a whore as the first lady? Guess what, everybody? There was. So the wives of everybody in Washington boycott the inaugural. They won't let their husbands go to the inaugural because a whore is presiding and most of the husbands have been sleeping with her. So Jackson can't have his cabinet meet at his inauguration. It takes Jackson several months before he can get his cabinet to meet. Why? Because all their wives wouldn't let him meet. In the history books, we call this petticoat government. All of Washington was brought to gridlock because of this whore in the White House, Little Peg. Now, during that whole time, there was one member other than John Eaton, Secretary of War Eaton, and one other member of the cabinet went to the inauguration and went to all the meetings. He was the only one that was nice to Peg. More on him in a moment. So what happens is after 2 terms as president, with the scandal of Little Peg the whore serving as first lady, Jackson announces he's stepping down from office. The 22nd Amendment, which limited a president to 2 terms, did not go into effect until 1953. But Jackson decided he'd step down. Now, he's going to handpick his successor. He announces that the person that's going to be the next president is going to be that one guy who went to all the cabinet meetings and was nice to Peg. His name was Marty Van Buren. Van Buren would become the 8th president of the United States. Why would Van Buren become president? Because Jackson endorsed him. Why did Jackson endorse him? Because he was nice to the whore, Little Peg. Why was Van Buren the only member of the cabinet that went to all the meetings? Because he was a widower. He had lost his wife. He didn't have a wife home to tell him he couldn't go to the meetings. So it's a giant scandal. At any rate, Peggy's husband, Secretary Eaton, is a lot older than her, so he dies long before her. And Peggy continues to scandalize Washington. Why? She goes to parties unescorted, and she's sleeping with everybody in the city. A huge affair breaks. There's an Italian ballet dancer. His name is Antonio Buccinani. He's all of 21 years old. He comes to Washington and Peg starts an affair with him. Now, here's the thing. Peg's old enough to be his grandmother. So long before Cher and Demi Moore and Madonna, Peg was the original colonial cougar. Then she marries this 21-year, and I live in Boca, so I know a lot about, I'm not from personal experience, but from watching the Cougars of Boca. So Peg marries this 21-year-old guy, Buccinani. They go away on their honeymoon. She wakes up one day and Buccinani's gone. He leaves, goes back to Washington, takes all of her possessions, takes her granddaughter, cleans out her bank account, and moves back to Italy. Now Peg is alone. Peg has to move into an old woman's home, which is what they called it at the time, where she dies penniless and destitute. Now here's the kicker, though. The women of Washington could not stand Peg, but because she was married to Senator Eaton, she's buried in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington. The obituary was adorable. The obituary wrote, "While the women of Washington may have hated Peggy while she was alive, they are about to discover that she is now their neighbor forever," because she was buried in the cemetery. Ma, Ma, where's my pa? That's Grover Cleveland on the left. He was the 22nd and 24th president. He served 2 non-consecutive terms in the 1880s and 1890s. Now, Cleveland had a good friend. His name was Oscar Folsom. And Grover Cleveland and Oscar Folsom were law partners together in Buffalo, New York. They also went out drinking and eating together. And they also slept with the same woman together. She was a prostitute from Pennsylvania named Maria Halpin. The problem is Maria Halpin gets pregnant, and she, Oscar Folsom, and Grover Cleveland, none of them know who the father is. She gives birth to a son, and she complicates things by naming him Oscar Cleveland. So Grover Cleveland is a bachelor. Oscar Folsom is married and has a daughter. So Cleveland assumes paternity. By that, I mean he paid to send the boy to an orphanage. Remember, everyone, the good old days weren't so good. Now, so what happens is Cleveland sends the little boy to an orphanage. What happened to Folsom? His law partner, Oscar Folsom, dies in a carriage wreck. He breaks his neck in a carriage wreck. Cleveland takes care of the widow and her little daughter, Frances. He sends the daughter to college. Cleveland makes a lot of money. They do very well. Then Cleveland gets elected president. What happens during his presidency is he starts writing letters to his goddaughter, Oscar Folsom's daughter, Frances. Frances is only 21 years old. And Cleveland's letter, he's old enough to be her grandfather. He's a sitting president. Cleveland's letters get hot and steamy. If I smoked a cigarette, I would have had to light a cigarette when I read the letters. He's saying to her, I've got to have you. I mean, this is hot and steamy stuff. I guess it's like those penthouse letters, or so I'm told. So Cleveland wants to marry his 21-year-old goddaughter while he's the bachelor sitting president of the United States. The widow realizes it's a bit too much, so she takes Frances and they go on a ship and they sail to Europe. Now, Cleveland misses her, so he sends her a bunch of letters. The letters are intercepted by the paparazzi who reprint them, just like today. However, Cleveland never mentioned this young 21-year-old girl, Frances, by name in all of his love letters. He used all those terms that Nicole and Ashley and Jen use, all that stuff like lovey-dovey, sweetie pie, honey bunches, you know, whatever. What do you use, Jen? Sweetie? What about you, Nicole? Cupcakes?
On.
I'm sorry.
No comment, right? Too much information. So Cleveland uses all those lovey-dovey names. So the paparazzi thinks Cleveland's trying to marry the widow, not the young girl, the 21-year-old girl. So when they're sailing back to New York, the widow goes back to New York on the ship. All the paparazzi jump her to get the story. Meanwhile, Frances, in the middle of the night on the open seas, climbs down over the side of the ship on a rope and gets in the presidential yacht and sails back to Washington. There's an image on the left. They get married in a secret ceremony in the White House. He's her godfather, old enough to be her grandfather. She's all of 21, everybody. Jackie Kennedy was 31 when she became president. She became first lady. On the right is a cartoon criticizing Cleveland. It shows a baby saying, I want my pa, because Cleveland had a child out of wedlock and then marries a young woman. So Cleveland's Republican critics used to dog him everywhere he went, yelling, Ma, Ma, where's my pa? After Cleveland wins the presidency, the Democrats respond, gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha. So it's a huge scandal when he marries Frances. However, Frances is, here's a picture of them. Doesn't Cleveland look like Wilford Brimley, everybody? Jen and Nicole and Ashley are too young to remember Wilford Brimley, but the rest of y'all, you remember Wilford Brimley? Looks just like him. At any rate, so Frances is young, she's attractive, she's witty, she's a fashionista. She sets off fashion trends, hairdos, clothing, wherever she goes, much like Jackie Kennedy would in the 1960s. I remember my mother died young. My late mother looked a bit like Jackie Kennedy, and she'd always wear those pillbox hats and the high gloves and the sleeveless dresses, the big sunglasses. So just like Jackie Kennedy, Frances was a real fashion trendsetter. By the way, my mother used to dress me in those suits with the shorts, like John Jr. Anybody is old enough to remember those things. At any rate, so Frances becomes, Cleveland calls her Frankie. She calls him Uncle Cleve, which is kind of creepy because it's her husband. Frances becomes beloved by the public. She would give birth in the White House to a little girl. And that girl was so popular that they named a candy bar after the baby, Ruth Cleveland. That's Warren Harding on the left and his wife, Florence Harding. He always called her the Duchess. They used to take ships and go on cruises. And Harding would always invite his good friend and his friend's wife. Then what would happen is when Harding's wife fell asleep, And when Harding's friend fell asleep, Harding and his friend's wife would go out and misbehave in the lifeboats. Yep. So Harding had lots of mistresses when he was president. Here's a picture of two of them. The one on the left was his favorite mistress, Carrie Phillips. The problem was Carrie discovered that Harding was having an affair with a much younger mistress. She's on the right there. Her name's Nan Britton, and she's also only 21 years old. Same age as Monica, by the way. So Carrie Phillips threatened to release all of the love letters she exchanged with Harding if he doesn't break off the affair with that young woman. So Harding doesn't want to break off the affair with Nan Britton. So what happens, the Republican National Committee pays Carrie Phillips over $20,000 in hush money. This is in 1920, everybody. And they buy 2 tickets on a round the world cruise, a ship. And Carrie and her husband sail around the world to get her out of the way during the campaign and the election. Harding wins his election in 1920. Now, he has this affair with this young 21-year-old girl, Nan Britton. They even have a child out of wedlock, a little girl named Elizabeth. You all probably heard of the story of Harding getting caught in the closet in the White House with a young woman. That's Nan Britton, and then the story is true. So Harding would die halfway through his presidency in 1923 of a heart attack, and Harding was super corrupt. He used to always be considered the most corrupt president we've ever had. Leading historians now consider Harding to be the second most corrupt president we've ever had. I'll let you guess who the most corrupt president is. So Harding dies of a heart attack in San Francisco, California, while eating crabs floating in butter. And his wife, Florence, rushes back from San Francisco in advance of her husband's body, leading to rumors that maybe she poisoned it. It appears that she didn't. But what she does is she starts to gather up all of Harding's papers and burn them. Why? Because he was so corrupt. There were lots of love letters in there, evidence that he gave birth to his daughter, illegitimately, Elizabeth. Harding used to go drinking during Prohibition. They had strippers come to Harding's parties. You've probably heard of the Ohio Gang. This is the corrupt group of cronies for Harding that were selling off, fleecing the National Petroleum Reserve, bribery and kickbacks. Several of Harding's aides went to jail, including Albert Fall. That's where the expression "the fall guy" comes from. So Harding's wife burns, we believe, about half of all of his papers. So we know less about Harding than almost any other president. She was trying to cover the evidence. Now, of the other papers that survived, a lot of them were sealed, classified by a nephew and his Harding. We only got access to those papers a few years ago. I've read them. Oh my God, they're damning. They're so juicy. If they're so damning, I can't imagine what was in the papers that were burned. One of the things we found from the papers was Harding and this young girl, Nan Britton, used to like to have theme sex. What's theme sex? Well, I found out by reading the papers. Harding would dress as the cowboy and she dressed as an Indian. Or Harding dressed as the police officer and she dressed like the criminal. And they had all these theme things going on. So Warren Harding had one of the most philandering of all the presidents, for sure. I'll end with George and Martha. So George Washington, when he was a young man, was very, very ambitious. He always wanted to be an officer in the British military and a gentleman planner. The problem for Washington was that his father had died when he was a boy. And the father, even though he was wealthy, he left all the money to the 2 boys and girl from the first marriage. George was the oldest born of the second marriage to a woman named Mary Ball, who got nothing. So Mary Ball, George, and the younger siblings have to downgrade to a little farm. And George grows up not going to school like his older half-brothers, not being an officer. George is milking cows and shoveling for a life. So George wants to become somebody. He comes up with a plan for how he's going to be a famous, wealthy somebody. He's going to marry an older, wealthy woman, he says. He's looking again for those Boca Cougars. Did you see George in Boca? He would be huge, right, everybody? So George is going to marry an older, wealthy woman. Now, as best as we can tell from surviving letters, George went about 0 for 10 when he tried to court women as a young man. Why did George, who's a big, handsome guy, why did he go 0 for 10? Because he was trying to court the daughters of the wealthiest people in Virginia. George writes a letter where he says he goes to one house and he knocks on the door. It's a mansion in Tidewater, Virginia. The servant comes out and gets the father, and the father comes up and takes one look at George, and according to George's letter says, quote unquote, "My daughter is a star out of thy orbit." And he slams the door in Washington's face, laughing. Washington goes home and writes, "Woe is me, I'm unlucky at love." He says, "I'll never find love." And George Washington writes a "Roses are red, violets are blue" poem. He ends it with the line, "My poor wounded heart has been shot through by Cupid's dart." Poor George. So George is trying to court an older, wealthy woman, and he's unsuccessful. However, he meets a woman named Sally Carey Fairfax, and there she is. She's 2 years George's senior. She's one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. Her husband is Lord Fairfax, as in Fairfax County or Fairfax, Virginia. Now, Sally's quite something, and she and George are wild about one another. Sally's very flirtatious with this big, gangly teenager. It's Sally that teaches George to dance, basically to read, teaches him the art of social discourse. Sally is really grooming George. George is in a battle out near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which was the Wild, Wild West at the time, called the Braddock Expedition. It's during the 1750s, during the French and Indian War. Braddock and the English lead a massive army out to wipe out the French and Indians. George is a young aide to Braddock. Braddock leads his army right into an ambush. And what happens is Braddock and every officer is killed. Half the army is slaughtered. That's when George Washington becomes George. He jumps on Braddock's horse and organizes an orderly retreat. He saves the army. He has 2 horses shot out from under him and 4 bullet holes through his jacket. At one point, George jumps off a horse and kills an Indian with his bare hands because the Indian's ready to tomahawk one of Washington's friends. George then runs and jumps back on a running horse. He's a hero. He's a legend. This is the George Washington of history. Now, what happens is George is engaged to Martha. So he writes a letter to her. We call it the Votary to Love letter. There's a picture, a painting rather, of Washington in blue looking down at General Braddock as he's dying during this chaotic battle where the British get slaughtered by the French and Indians. So what happens is George writes a letter to Martha, with whom he's engaged, and he says to her in the letter, he's trying to explain his suicidal bravery on the battlefield, why he was so, heroic. And he says to her, "For if I had died, it would matter not. For in your eyes, I would have died a hero. I profess myself a votary to love." That's pretty good, isn't it, everybody? Mr. King, I hope you're taking notes because I'm giving you another good line on here. A votary to love, Barbara. So at any rate, here's the problem. George wasn't writing that letter to Martha like we thought. He was writing it to Sally Carey Fairfax. He was engaged to Martha, but writing a love letter to Sally. So George was being naughty. George and Sally were madly in love, but Lord Fairfax is a loyalist, a royalist. That is, he's pro-British, pro-crown. So when the Revolutionary War breaks out, he goes back to England. And George and Sally would never see one another again. It's a sad love story. They write letters, and George begs her to come back to Virginia, but they never see one another again. Here's one of George's letters. He writes to Sally, and says, "Do we misunderstand the true meaning of each other's letters? I think it must appear so, though I would fain hope the contrary, as I cannot speak plainer without, but I'll say no more and leave you to guess the rest." So that's pretty obvious and pretty nice, right, everyone? So Sally moves back to England. Her husband, Lord Fairfax, dies long before her, and she retires to the resort of Bath, England. She goes to Bath. Now, in Bath, England, she's this famous older woman that kind of like a Dear Abby or Dear Ann Landers. If a woman is going to get married, she consults Sally and asks her what to do. If a lady is being courted by a duke, an count, and an earl, she contacts Sally and asks Sally who she should marry. So that's basically Sally. While Sally's back in Bath, George is writing to her, hoping they can see one another. They never would. Here's what appears to be the last letter George wrote to her. He's writing from Mount Vernon, reflecting on their lives together. 25 years have nearly passed away since I have considered myself as the permanent resident at this place, Mount Vernon. During this period, so many important events have occurred: the revolution, his presidency, none of which events, however, nor all of them together, have been able to eradicate from my mind the recollection of those happy moments, the happiest in my life, which I have enjoyed in your company. Wow. George was in love with Sally, and they'd never see one another again. We have a letter from Sally late in her life where there's a young woman who's being courted by multiple wealthy men. She doesn't know which duke to marry, so she asks Sally who to marry. And Sally writes back and she says, none of them. It's not the man with money. It's not the little aristocrat. It's the big self-made man, the man who defines his times, the man who's a warrior and a beast on the battlefield, the man who is, she describes George in the letter. So Sally is pining away for George as well. George and Sally would never see one another, but George would marry Martha and they would have a solid marriage together. I'm going to end by just showing you a couple of John Kennedy's mistresses. John Kennedy wins the award for the most mistresses. Now, I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember Hollywood in the 60s, but Kennedy was sleeping with an A-list of Hollywood actresses. Nicole, should I show everybody the photos? Is that okay? Then we'll end it.
Sure, yeah.
All right, here's a partial list of John Kennedy's mistresses. I went to the Kennedy Library in Boston and did a research project with the staff there to try to find out the name of them. So the most affairs goes to Kennedy. Here's one of them, Mimi Fanenstock. That's her on the left when she was an intern from Vassar College for Jackie Kennedy. Kennedy was sleeping with his wife's intern. That's her today on the right. There had always been a rumor that Kennedy had this mistress named Mimi, but nobody could prove it. A few years ago, the woman on the right calls a press conference. She walked up to the microphone and announces, I am the Mimi, announcing that she was the one. Then everything she said squared away with history. This is Florence Pritchett. She was a socialite in Palm Beach that you can see Kennedy when he was in the Navy had an affair with her. This is Pamela Turner. That's her with Jackie on the left. Get this, she was Jackie Kennedy's secretary. Kennedy's having an affair with his wife's secretary and intern. That's Kim Novak. Anybody remember her? She was a Hollywood actress. Anybody? Like, am I getting any yeses? Am I getting any no's? Let me look through here. Yeah, okay. Rose, Jeanette, Susan, Linda, Addie. Good. Okay, you all recognize her. Good. Thanks, gang. My dad liked her, I remember. That's Kim Novak. Do y'all remember this person? Oh, yeah. You remember Janet Leigh from Psycho, right? We sometimes forget. Before Psycho, she was a beautiful actress who did a lot of other films. Remember Jane Mansfield, everybody? Oh, yeah. Kennedy had an affair with both of her. Remember Angie Dickinson, anyone? Policewoman. That's policewoman on the right. On the left, before she got into acting, she was a model. Kennedy was inaugurated on January 20th, 1961. Jackie was not feeling well, so she took the limo and went back to the White House early. Kennedy, at the last ball of the evening, has a ball. He goes up to the penthouse with Angie Dickinson, the model, and spends the night up there with her, the night of his inauguration. Talk about reckless and foolish. Olivia de Havilland, remember her, everybody? Yeah, I know. I think she was one of the greats. So Kennedy has an affair with her. Peggy Cummins, anybody, if you remember her? She was always like the B actress, the one that would be eaten by the monster or killed early in the movie or would scream. That was her one line. So Kennedy had an affair with her, another actress. Angela Green, I'm sure some of you remember her, another famous actress from the 60s. Gene Tierney, yep, that was my dad's favorite. I remember Gene Tierney when I was a kid, and he'd show me old movies. Blaze Starr, you all know her now. Own up. She was the stripper in New Orleans from Baltimore. New Orleans stripper. Kennedy was sleeping with Blaze Starr. Mary Pinchot Meyer. She was a young socialite in Washington, D.C., and she gets killed by a mugger. And her uncle is Ben Bradley, the Washington Post editor. Remember him? He goes back to her apartment to clean it up after her death, and he finds her diary, where she describes in vivid detail everything she did with Kennedy. Dory Malcolm, she was another Palm Beach socialite. We don't know for sure, but there's some secondhand kind of evidence that she and Kennedy got married, but Kennedy's dad, Joe, had it annulled and paid off everybody enough hush money to keep it quiet. Inga and Ellen, these are two East German spies. Their code name was Inga Binga. The two of them, Kennedy would have threesomes with these two. My God, how foolish and idiotic. East German spies, they could have killed him or poisoned him or something. Kennedy would meet with them in seedy hotel rooms and make the Secret Service wait outside. So how irresponsible. Inga and Binga. That's Judith Campbell. Y'all probably remember her because of the guy on the right. That's not Joe Pesci. That's Sam Giancana. He was the Chicago mob boss. Remember, everybody? So Kennedy is sleeping with the mob boss's favorite mistress. Talk about wanting to get whacked and having a death wish. Crazy, crazy stuff. I'll end it there. That's my book on the topic. Yeah, along with Marilyn Monroe and everybody else. So Kennedy was wild and reckless. So with that, I'll end it, and I'll be happy to take any questions you all have.
All right. Well, that was something very
Yeah.
interesting.
You don't get those lectures every day, and that's my only book like that.
No, I mean, just purely from the end of it, of all those women, and I mean, they were so beautiful, and all these women, but it's like, I can't believe how many there were.
I wrote in one source I published, I wrote, who had time to govern?
That's what I mean. Like, it's like, what was happening there? Like, it's crazy.
It's surreal.
Yeah, and it's not talked about the way, it's always focused on Marilyn or, the other, you don't really hear about all these.
And Jackie knew about it. What Jackie used to do is Kennedy had two secretaries that came in about twice a week. Their code name was Fiddle and Faddle. It's in the social files in the Kennedy Library. And they would have three-ways with Kennedy, and then they'd leave after lunch. Jackie would always go out for lunch. And what she would do is on her way back to the White House, she would call ahead and give her ETA. She knew about it. She just didn't want to be confronted with it. So she knew about it. There's a story in the Kennedy Library. An historian interviewed a maid that worked in the White House. And the maid, and all presidents and first ladies, everybody had separate bedrooms. The first couple that shared a bedroom in history, the Eisenhowers. All the rest had separate bedrooms in the presidency. The Kennedys and Johnsons went back to separate bedrooms. The Fords then shared a bedroom, as did the Carters. A lot of the others, including the Trumps and Clinton, would have separate bedrooms for obvious reasons. But at any rate, the maid was in John Kennedy, President Kennedy's suite upstairs in the White House, cleaning the room and making the bed. Jackie Kennedy walks in, and there's a gala that night at the White House. So Jackie is picking out a suit for her husband. While she's standing in a closet picking out a suit, the maid takes the pillowcase off, and when she takes it off, little panties fall out. And the maid says in the interview that without missing a beat, Jackie Kennedy looks at the maid and says, "Get rid of those, they're not mine." So she knew, she just didn't talk about it. So.
Wow. And so that Bernard asked, how did he meet Martha?
How did George meet Martha?
Yeah.
Good story. So Martha was a year older than George. Martha married a man who was the heir of the wealthiest tobacco fortune in all of Virginia. So Martha, whose first husband died young, Martha was the wealthiest widow in all of Virginia. George was out in Western Pennsylvania as a young man. He's about 25. He's in the battlefield. George is riding back from the battle, and he's racing to Williamsburg. Why? Because he wants to get to Williamsburg that night, because in the morning he has a meeting with the governor of Williamsburg, Governor Robert Dinwiddie. Now, if you're an ambitious young guy like George, you can't wait to meet with the governor. So George is racing quick on horseback to get back there that night. He stops at a man's house named Chamberlain to water the horse. Chamberlain says to George, "Why don't you stay for dinner?" George says, "I got to get to Williamsburg. I'm meeting with the governor in the morning." Chamberlain says, "Well, that's a shame, because joining me for dinner tonight is Martha Dandridge Custis, the wealthiest widow in all of Virginia." When George hears that, he changes his mind and stays for dinner. George stays the night. George stays for breakfast. He's late getting to Williamsburg. After George goes to Williamsburg for the meetings with the governor, George goes back to Martha's mansion. She has 4 mansions. One of them is in Williamsburg. George goes to Martha's mansion, and he writes a letter to Martha's London merchant. His name is Robert Cary, C-A-R-Y. The letter still survives. And in the letter, George asks for a wedding band and a nightgown for the night of the wedding. So George moved with lightning speed. He proposes marriage as soon as he met Martha. So that's how he met her. They would have a decent marriage. It wasn't a passionate one, but it was a good partnership.
Okay. And Rose, I see you there. Go ahead.
You said Mamie and Dwight they slept in the same bed. So Dwight wasn't a philanderer?
Eisenhower, good question. Eisenhower had an affair during World War II with a British woman named Kay Summersby.
His driver.
Yes, correct. It was his driver. You're spot on. Or as I called her, his backseat driver. Kay was a model. Eisenhower has to pick a driver. He's the Supreme Allied Commander. You always pick a young captain or major. He picks a model. Kay Summersby would write a book about their affair, describing details of it. Mamie heard about this when she was back stateside. She was, embarrassed, appalled, crushed. Eisenhower stopped the affair when he came back home. I've interviewed Eisenhower's grandkids and former staffers, all who told me about it. I also looked it up. But Ike stopped his affair, and Mamie kind of forgave, and they shared a bedroom together in the White House, as did the Fords and Carters. But again, virtually every other first couple and everyone before the Eisenhowers had separate bedrooms on opposite ends of the second floor of the White House.
And
I remember.
Yeah, go ahead.
I remembered from seeing, I believe it was one of the war movies, that he had a female driver that but it didn't stick with the noggin until you said it. So,
Yeah,
but
Kate
thank
Summersby.
you.
I had interviewed one of his senior aides, as well as one of the commanders in the war. And they said that it was pretty well known in headquarters about Kay Summersby and Ike. But they both also said that virtually everyone in headquarters was having an affair with one of the secretaries. It was a war, it was World War II. The secretaries, the generals, everybody, I guess, was of that frame of mind. They indicated that it was pretty common, and Ike and Kay were it was obvious, that people knew about it. And when he traveled, she went with him and stayed with him. So yeah, it wasn't a big secret.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And this has been very, very interesting. I, if I can find the book and can afford it, I'm going to get it.
Well, the good news is it's in paperback. So it should be cheap. And the other good news, it's on Amazon.com or Barnes and Noble, wherever books are, and buy the paperback. That'll save you money. It's probably about $10. I would say $8 to $10 online paperback.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Dr.
Thank you
Watson.
again, and thank you for coming to yet another lecture. I remember and
Oh,
I
yeah.
appreciate it.
Right. And Roxanne, I do see you have your hand up.
I just wanted to ask you a question about Abraham Lincoln. And I know that there was so much tragedy with his wife and the loss of his son and his wife's mental state. Can you say anything at all about that?
Yeah. So Mary Todd lost her mother when she was a young girl, and Lincoln lost his mother when he was a young boy. So they both had that loss. The South never forgives Mary Todd for marrying Lincoln. The North never trusts her because she came from a slave-owning family. Virtually all of her male relatives died during the war. The Lincolns have 4 children, all of them boys. Edward Baker dies right around his 3rd birthday before the war. Their son, William Wallace, Willie, dies in February of 1862 in the middle of the Civil War, and Mary Todd has to carry on. Lincoln is killed in her arms at Ford's Theater in the box in April of 65 at the end of the war. Mary Todd is a francophile, so she flees to France, takes their youngest son, Thomas, nicknamed Taddy. He had severe learning disabilities. She has a fall when she's there, hits her head, so she comes back stateside to live with a sister, and Taddy dies when they get back. Her only remaining son, Robert, her firstborn, has her committed to an insane asylum in Batavia, Illinois, called Bellevue. And he sets up a trial where she's not allowed to call witnesses. It's a sham. So Mary Todd lives a life of tragedy. She was a few cards shy of a full deck, but who wouldn't be, given all the loss that she endured? So I am one of the historians that takes a more simple. There's one historian named Michael Burlingame who just hammers Mary Todd for criminal activity. I mean, that just really goes after her. I take the view that I forgive her indulgences because of the tragedies in her life. She was an otherwise impressive woman but what she was a roller coaster emotionally, and she could break down sobbing and screaming on the turn of a dime. She also, Mary Todd also suffered from like these panic attacks and massive headaches where she just would collapse. And so, yeah, the poor woman. But yeah, a life of tragedy for both Lincoln and Mary Todd, no question.
Dottie, I see your hand.
Yes, I was just thank you so much for what you've told us today. With the enormous number of past presidents who've had affairs, are there who's the top president who didn't have any affairs?
Good,
Can you
good.
name a few that were really true to their wives?
Thanks, Dottie. Yeah, there have been some bad marriages in the history of the White House, and there have been some good marriages in the history of the White House. I write a book a year. This book took me 10 years because I had to read hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of diaries and letters and gossip and all that. to find out, the stories. And of course, you read 90 diaries of nothing to find one that had an affair in it. So I had reached out to historians all across the country that were friends of mine and asked them if they knew of anything to let me know who had affairs and who didn't, and give me some details so I could go and track it down. I also reached out to archivists at all the presidential libraries and all the major museums, having them assist me with my research by telling all them, if you have heard of any affairs, let me know. If you know of anybody that's faithful, let me know. So I've had dozens and dozens of conversations with dozens and dozens of archivists and leading historians around the country on this. And we're certain about the stories I told you. There's written archival records admitting this. But we're also certain that there's a few presidents who never had affairs, who were very faithful to their wives. And two of these wonderful marriages, John and Abigail Adams, for sure, and Harry and Bess Truman, for sure. Jimmy and Roz Carter, for sure. So there have been some really good marriages in the history of the presidency and some faithful ones, including those three. I don't believe the Coolidges had affairs, although Grace was accused of having an affair by her husband, Calvin, who was a stick in the mud. I think on this one, he probably jumped the gun. Grace liked to hike. She was out hiking at a national park once when they were traveling, and they assigned a Secret Service officer to her. They come back late. Coolidge accuses her of sleeping with a Secret Service officer. It appears they got lost in the woods. Coolidge reassigns the Secret Service officer to some crap job and, accuses his wife of something that my guess it wasn't valid. I don't believe the Obamas had affairs. I mean, they had more people that hated them than just about any other president. And if there was anything out there, my God, the people that are paying money and digging on this, it would have been public. So a few of them have not, but a few certainly have.
There's one last question, because I know we're over on time. So Susie just wants to know, how do you choose your topics for your books, and where does that come from?
Good, thank you, Susie. Every year around New Year's, I lecture on cruise ships, as I think most of you know, and every December I take a Christmas, New Year's holiday cruise. I do like a 2-weeker. And while I'm on it, I sit down and sketch out 5 books that I want to write. I do 5 ideas at a time. Why 5? Because inevitably I'll find out that one of them, there's just not enough archival information to write a book, so I can't write it. I'll find out like maybe there is a good book on that topic that I didn't know about, so why write it? Maybe my literary agent or my publisher will disagree with me and think it's a dumb idea. So I sketch out 5 topics at a time. All my books are on American history because I like American history. But what I do is I try to figure out things that other people have missed. So I spend a lot of time reading, lists of books on various wars, various events, various times in history. And then when I find things that are interesting or bizarre or little known, I dig and dig and dig to see if anybody's done a book on them. So most of my books are things that history has missed and historians have missed. That's my sweet spot. So that's one thing I do. The second thing I do is I'm nerdy about my topic. As you can probably tell, I love history. I spend 365 days a year on it. Even if I'm on vacation or at a party or a holiday or on a cruise, I still bring books and research along. And I always have a stack in my briefcase of 200-year-old letters. Not the actual, I make copies because I want to preserve it. But so the second thing I do is I want to write a book about every major, what I think are the most major and exciting things in American history. So I wrote a book on George Washington. I wrote a book on Lincoln. I wrote a book on Truman. I wrote a book on the Revolutionary War. I wrote a book on the Civil War. I wrote a book on the Holocaust. I wrote a book on World War II. So whatever's big, I write a book about. Now I wanted to write a book about the first pandemic in American history because we're in the midst of this pandemic. And I don't recall anybody ever telling me about it. So I found that there was a pandemic in 1793 that with eerie parallels to COVID, masks and people denying it was real and not wanting to be, so I'm writing right now and I hope to finish it in another month or two. A book, it's called 100 Days of Terror. It's about a 100-day pandemic that wiped out the capital and a lot of the country. So it was a yellow fever epidemic, not COVID.
Right.